So in this paper, I will begin with a short reading from the book, presuming that some of you haven't read it, just to give you a sense of it, because it is a narrative nonfiction and a kind of not particularly typical in terms of an academic monograph. And I'm going to also look at, after I give that short reading, I'm going to talk about the relationship between global history and microhistory, about the digital technologies that made this book possible, and about how I played with scales and the idea of playing with scales. And in general, why I took the approach I did to this history, to this story, history. You can decide which one it is, or both. But first, a reading from the book, which is quite early in the book, so not too many spoilers, I hope. In January 1910, just a few months shy of her 17th birthday, Lydia Harvey disappeared. She bade farewell to the motley crew at Mrs. Logan's boarding house in downtown Wellington, where young men and women, new arrivals to the city, took their meals together in a threadbare dining room after long days of work. She wrote to her mother, who had her hands full of children back home in the small provincial town of Oamaru, telling her that she had taken a job as a nursemaid to a rich couple who were bringing her with them to London. She gave notice to Mr. Harlow at the photography studio, where she'd just gotten a new job, where families in nice clothes and lines of orderly children came to buy Kodak cameras to develop new pictures of their travels. Then she boarded a brand new steamship with 500 third-class berths and a triple expansion steam engine, which could cut through the waves of the Pacific and land her in Buenos Aires in less than a month's time. Then she seemed to disappear. A working-class provincial girl like Lydia was meant to be a respectable servant in the home of a wealthier woman, scrubbing, cooking, and caring for children for well over 70 hours each week. This was, in fact, why she had first come to the big city, joining a small army of women who left rural and provincial towns the world over, traveling sometimes 10 and sometimes 10,000 miles on trains, roads, and steamships to answer the hungry call of the urban middle classes for live-in domestic servants. For more than a century, this had been the natural order of things. Working-class young women were essential fixtures in middle and upper-class households, without whom the wealthy would have to scrub and cook and care for themselves. But as the 20th century dawned, this system was in crisis, and the demand for servants far outstripped the supply. More and more young women were expressing their opinions on domestic service with their feet. Like many others, Lydia was desperate to pull herself out of this low-paid, low-status job, and seizing one of the growing opportunities for young women in shop work, she had landed a post at a photographer's studio. It was a move up, but she still wore plain cotton and unfashionable hats, and her purse was empty by the end of the month. A new world of travel, luxury, and consumer goods lay just beyond her grasp. She had seen the nice dresses and the fine shoes in the windows of shops and in the tissue-thin pages of catalogs. She had held the cameras and the travel photographs. Each morning as her commuter train snaked its way to Mr. Harlow's photography studio, she saw the steamships at anchor in Wellington's wide blue harbor, waiting to carry people to Sydney, London, and New York. As she returned home, she walked among the young women who smoked cigarettes and danced the night away, who kissed young men in corners, who had begun to claim the dangerous, exciting spaces of the city as their own. So when she met a beautiful woman named Marie Vernon and a handsome man who called himself Aldo Cellis, who said they would give her nice dresses and help her to travel, she made the wager of a lifetime. 3 weeks later, a once unaffordable steamship ticket to Argentina was in her hands. Lydia was one of almost 3 million migrants who arrived in Buenos Aires' Puerto Madero in the years between 1887 and 1911. This was Argentina's golden age, a period of economic and population boom, fueled by foreign investment in transport, agriculture, and industry, and by territorial and imperial expansion. All over Latin America, in fact, the labor market had expanded rapidly. Immigrants, especially Spanish, Italian, and Eastern European Jews, flooded into the cities and towns. In Panama, the boat trains carried passengers, soldiers, and sailors from one ocean to the other, while the nearly completed canal project attracted thousands of single male laborers. In Argentina, the violent seizure of indigenous land by the state had opened up Las Pampas, the fertile grasslands of the interior, to a new style of ranching and farming that hungered for seasonal male labor, at exactly the same time that advances in refrigeration on steamships meant that fresh Argentinian beef and pork could reach the supper tables of Europe and the Pacific. With this huge rise in migrant male labor, it's no surprise that the commercial sex market was also booming. Buenos Aires was one of the epicenters of the global intersection of labor, entertainment, and sex. The Argentine capital had been famous for its association with open prostitution since at least the 1870s, and pimps and prostitutes of various nationalities had flocked there, attracted by the high ratio of male occupants, a huge population of men who came occasionally into the centers from rural and isolated sites, an enormous immigrant and transient population, and an urban tourism center renowned for its modern, exciting, and racy nightlife. Amid perennial debates about the best way to manage commercial sex, venereal disease, and criminality, Buenos Aires had, by the late 1880s, become home to one of the most infamous regulated prostitution systems in the world. It is unlikely that 17-year-old Lydia Harvey knew any of this, but she must have known upon arrival that she was far from home. As she joined the crowds on the steamship's deck, she could see an enormous metropolis, a city that could eat Wellington like a whale would eat a herring, stretching out from the crowded port at the end of a muddy estuary. She thought the ship was going to run headlong into another. There were more vessels here than she had ever seen, ships moored to other ships, stacked 2 or 3 deep along the wharf, the smoke from their coal engines spewing into great clouds, the masts of the smaller sailing vessels tangled together in the sky. She must have alighted with her stomach turning in waves of excitement and dread. But when the handsome man and the beautiful woman met her beneath the Buenos Aires sun, their masks began to slip. She was taken out into the pulsing, shining city to buy nice dresses. A woman came to their apartment and bleached her hair blonde. She was shown how to put on makeup. Then she was forced to sell sex to old and disgusting men in the city's notorious teatro casino. Old and disgusting men is a direct quote from her. Then she was to the teatro casino, where she contracted a sexually transmitted infection and, after a police raid on their illegal brothel, was dragged to London, locked in the stateroom of a steamship. 6 harrowing months later, Lydia was finally found in London by Metropolitan Police detectives, shivering in a hand-me-down dress and trying to catch the eye of passing men under the electric lights of Piccadilly Circus. They brought her back to Great Marlborough Street Police Station, and here she told her story, or at least the parts the police wanted to hear and the parts that she elected to reveal. Lydia's story, however it was told, unfolded in an era that was obsessed with the idea of the exploited prostitution of young white women. The public was hungry to read such melodramatic, sexualized stories of innocence and ruin, and books with titles like From Dance Hall to White Slavery and The Girl Who Disappeared became early 20th century bestsellers. To the authors of cheap newspaper articles and novels and exposés, Lydia Harvey was another bit of fodder for a salacious plot or an eye-catching headline. To those who campaigned for better laws and policies to rescue and reform trafficking victims, Lydia Harvey was a morality tale. In the eyes of moralizers and sensationalizers alike, Lydia Harvey was a girl. That is, an unmarried, working-class young woman who was dangerously unformed. Girls like Lydia were in need of protection and control in order to prevent them being lost into the twilight world of vice and prostitution. Inside the stories other people told about her, the real Lydia Harvey disappeared again and again. She was no one. Who she was, what she wanted, what happened afterward, none of this mattered. She joined a legion of missing girls, whose brief appearances in newspapers and books remained uncomplicated by their past experiences of poverty, abuse, or their exploitation in legal kinds of work. No one took any notice of their dreams, ambitions, and desires. And in the hands of newspaper reporters and moral reformers, stories like Lydia's served as cautionary tales for any young woman, any young working class woman who longed for adventure and travel, for better pay or better working conditions, and, if they dared to imagine it, for a life of luxury and romance. The end of the story was always an imagined punishment for the girls who had, in the parlance of the time, been ruined. Quote, "Her slavery lasts some 5 or 6 years as a rule," one dramatic writer noted, "and then she's flung out upon the streets, her character gone, her hope dead, her body diseased, to die before long, either in a workhouse or a lock hospital." The missing girls in these ubiquitous stories were condemned to a short life of misery, disease, and degradation. They vanished forever beneath the slime of the underworld, to quote someone else, and remained literally nameless and unknown. So that's how I set the book up. And I first encountered Lydia Harvey the way that most historians encounter any nobody from the past, filtered, dislocated, and preserved in the imperfect amber of an archive file. MIPO 3/197 to be exact, in the UK National Archives. She was one of hundreds of people I had encountered in this same archive who were caught up in the early 20th century sex industry just as the police and the public were panicking about it. And I assumed that I couldn't know very much about her. I assumed this, and I think most social and cultural historians assume similar things, in part because I believed that there was little more that I could discover, that I had caught a glimpse of a marginalized person who was caught like a fly, as Tonio Andrade puts it, between the pages of a larger archive. I had assumed that Lydia had disappeared from history when the detective inspector in charge of the case relayed the news of her repatriation in his final report and placed it in the thick file and closed the cover. Our ability to discover anything at all about the obscure, humble, and marginalized individuals in the past inspires fascination. As John Arnold writes, "There is little more seductive in social history than the promise of access to the voices of those normally absent from the historical record." But this fascination, this seduction, always exists in productive tension with our inability to discover everything about them. About Minocchio, we know many things, Ginsberg writes in that famous work of microhistory, The Cheese and the Worms. About this Marcato, or Marco, or so many others like him who lived and died without leaving a trace, we know nothing. Perhaps the most astonishing thing about Hugh, writes Jonathan Spence in another example, is that we know anything about him at all. The boundlessness of the past has always been kept in check, not only by the boundedness of the archive and the library, but by our own cognitive and physical abilities to identify, search, collect, and connect records. This, argues Anne Rigney, is where history meets the sublime, where historians concede, surrender even, and accept the limitations on their ability to know, comprehend, and represent a boundless past, particularly the obscure and humble people within it. And yet, our ability to search for needles in haystacks is getting better and better. The developments over the past 4, let alone 40 years, are dizzying. We have an incredible surge in digitized records, particularly in the Anglophone world, but actually other places are also catching up. We have billions of individually character-searchable family history records and genealogical records. We have similarly billions of digitized newspaper archives, which are now character-searchable. And for places like Ancestry.com, 2 million records are being added to the site every single day. So we have this much, and it's growing almost exponentially every day. The digitization of sources, coupled with new technologies with which to process, interpret, and communicate them, is transforming the way we do history and the kind of history we can do. And yet, Lawrence Stone's 1979 comments about the challenges of keeping this kind of digital data under intellectual control remain apt, although other things about that article do not remain apt. Even the most technophile writer on digital history often refers to the feeling of having a vertiginous number of sources at their fingertips. Individual researchers are daunted by their, quote, 10,000 digital note cards, lost in, quote, a sea of information, searching, quote, a digital haystack, dealing with gaps of excess, and, with a compelling term coined by William Turkel, an infinite archive. As Daniel J. Cohen argued in a recent Journal of American History interchange on digital history, quote, it's now quite clear that historians, I think we could say modern historians especially, have to grapple with abundance, not scarcity. For most historians who consider these issues, confronting abundance has meant thinking big. What is desperately needed, wrote Armitage and Gouldy in their provocative History Manifesto, is a training capable of weaving data together into one interrelated fabric of time. Digitization for them is a tool best used in service to big history and the longue durée. Tim Hitchcock, who was one of the lead historians on one of the most successful digitization projects of the past decade, that is the digitization of the Old Bailey records, has a very different take. He worries that a discourse of digitization that focuses solely on big data pushes out humanist perspectives in favor of social scientific ones. He feels that historians need to be far more reflective on how digitization is changing the way we work, and far quicker to defend our particular and humanist way of understanding the past against the tide of cultural analytics. And he argues that actually what we can do with these incredible number of records is not write big history at all, but write a much more carefully contextualized history from below. And this conversation grows ever more urgent. Gaps of excess, scarcity, knowability, and representability are all being dramatically reconfigured virtually daily by digitization projects. And we do have the capacity for the first time ever to write this kind of carefully contextualized history from below. I would not have been able to write this book 10 years ago. I'm not sure if I even would have been able to write it 5 years ago because it relies on the mass digitization of data. And I'll say more about other ways in which I wouldn't have been able to write this book towards the end. So what are the possibilities now that our ability to chase so many people out of the bounded archive has become so much greater, faster, and finer grained? The disappearance of Lydia Harvey is, in part, an experiment in trying to answer that question through the lens of a modern global microhistory. And it feels in some way that the kind of global history versus microhistory debates are a cipher through which we're having a lot of our big history versus small history arguments. And so I was really keen to write a global microhistory, to sort of join a growing number of books that connect the global and the micro and sort of demonstrate the ways in which it doesn't need to be either or. Though to the best of my knowledge, I think that most attempts to write global microhistories still are in the early modern and medieval periods, and that there's not as many modern microhistories and modern global microhistories. I'm collecting a list, so if you have any suggestions at the end, please do let me know. I'm also continuously wondering why we have so many fewer modern microhistories, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well. It really started when I thought, what would happen if I chased Lydia Harvey off the archive page? If I tried to give her a beginning and an end? If I stopped treating her as an example that I was going to use to walk briefly across the stage of my historical argument, and instead started thinking about her as a person with a whole and complicated life, following her life course, like a family historian would, rather than following the category into which I had placed her, like an academic historian would. I also wondered whether these technologies would help me play with scale, so help me go from the very small to the very big rapidly. I'm pleased to say they did work that way. And so I started typing, searching in mostly genealogical records, Ancestry.com, Family Search, Find My Past, et cetera, and in the digitized newspapers, particularly of Australia and New Zealand. And there she was, this woman who I thought I was never going to be able to find. My first re-encounter with Lydia Harvey was in a tiny column in the Oamaru Mail, located by careful character searching. And there she was, the girl I thought I could know nothing more about, standing on a stage, winning a silver purse as the runner-up in a beauty contest in the town's brand new opera house in 1909. From there, I collated hundreds more glimpses, found new archive files through focused searches and also just through sheer serendipity. I pieced these together with genealogical data, immigration records, and steamship manifests. I was able to trace Lydia Harvey and her trafficker's journey from Oamaru to Wellington on the steamship, and then on to Buenos Aires and London. I used novels, short stories, and local histories to illuminate the texture of where she lived and how she worked. And I'm happy to say more about the way that I used fiction from the time to do that. I also went physically to as many places as I could. This book was written just on the eve of the coronavirus pandemic, but luckily all of my traveling research was done before it hit, because I definitely wouldn't have been able to get into New Zealand had I not done it in time. So I went physically to as many places as I could, using old photographs and maps laid like a palimpsest upon new streets and buildings. So a lot of this involved walking and standing in front of houses and looking like a bit of a creep. And actually, I was invited in. I was doing just that in Melbourne, taking a picture of a residential house, and the people arrived as I was doing it and obviously wanted to know why I was photographing their home. And I explained it to them, and they invited me in for tea and gave me a tour. So I was able to see Veronique White's childhood home, which was kept in really perfect condition from the original. From the original. So that was wonderful. So many thanks to them. They're thanked in the acknowledgments. So I did a lot of walking. I did a lot of creeping people out and sometimes convincing them to let me in their houses. I finally discovered the truth about Lydia Harvey's very elusive family in the partially preserved magistrates' court records for Oamaru, which were kept at the Dunedin archives. Scribbled on the page, her mother's name, taking Harry G.C. Harvey, a local solicitor and the son of a district court judge, to court for non-payment of a child maintenance order. Thanks to Chris Mitchum at the Waitaki District Archive in Otago, I even found a school photograph, which encapsulates the sublime pain of all I cannot know, because the school photograph has Lydia Harvey in it, but I don't know which girl she is, which is, I've come to understand, just symbolic after I got over my initial agony of coming so close to seeing what she looked like. I've got my guesses. I know that she had dark hair, and I know that she had two cousins in the school, and there are three girls whose hair is all dark and styled the same way, and I know that one of them is labeled, and so yeah, I've got theories. But that wouldn't be good history to be like, I've decided it's her because of vibes. Thanks to Chris Mitchum for finding me that sublimely painful photograph. I later learned that Lydia did well enough in school, but did not distinguish herself as a scholar. As the oldest child in a family of 7 daughters, there were likely more pressing things to do than study. And then in 1909, when she was 16 and finishing her schooling, Lydia's mother felt the familiar flutter in her belly once again. In May that year, there would be twins. Lydia was the eldest of what were now 7 daughters, and a set of twins meant that she would practically be the mother of at least one. as any oldest daughter in a working class household would be. More nappies to boil and peg out on the line, more pots to scour, more mouths to feed, more bodies crowded into her bed. She loved her sisters, but if she stayed, she would surely disappear. And so she set out on her own, making use of the new and cheaper technologies of transportation and communication, and, like hundreds of thousands of other young women, leaving the safety of her home and dreaming of better, dreaming of more. This was her mobile world, and I did my best to travel it on her terms. But her terms of engagement with this world were limited. She was the eldest bastard child of now 9 bastard children, which, by the way, was extraordinary in the context of New Zealand society. I have not found another woman in the entire period I was looking at. And thanks to amazing scholarship from BA and MA students at the University of Otago, they actually did a major survey of all the women who were having children out of wedlock. Nobody comes close to Emily Baidley for the number of children that she had out of wedlock. 9 daughters. Her father, Lydia's father, was of some use to her in the form of child payments when he was alive. But he was of no use to her at all when he died in his 32-room mansion in Christchurch in 1909. His estate made no mention of a child. The maintenance payments dried up. The twins were born, and Lydia Harvey did what hundreds of thousands of other girls did. She left home and she went into service. That same year, the New Zealand Servants' Union was formed. Their key demand? A 68-hour work week. The union was disbanded by the government before this demand was met. It remains unmet in global labor standards right up into the present day. From 120 years' distance, Lydia Harvey tells us that it's useless to consider women's exploitation and prostitution without also considering their exploitation in other forms of work. She also tells us that desire is at least as important as desperation when poor girls make difficult decisions about their lives. She met the people she knew as Aldo Cellis and Marie Vernon when she was introduced by a fellow lodger. "You'll have nice dresses and not want for anything and be quite happy," they promised her. "If you do as I do and see gentlemen." With pennies in her purse and stars in her eyes, she agreed. "I always wanted to travel," she said later, from a seat beside the fire in the Metropolitan Police Inspector's room in London's Soho. I began to wonder how the case, as I sort of delved deeper into Lydia's story and started piecing together her quite incredible family story, I began to wonder how the case might be further illuminated by applying the same technique of radical contextualization to the people she encountered along the way. The man and the woman who trafficked her, the police who prosecuted the case, the journalist who broke the story, and the social worker who ran a safe house in which Lydia stayed while awaiting trial. And so the book became a polyvocal history, or a history in the round, as I've also called it. This was another thing that digitization allowed me to do. Where once it would have been almost impossible to find one nobody, it made it conceivable to find several nobodies. And it turns out the man Lydia knew as Aldo Cellis had a story of his own. It took me a while to find him. He was adept at self-reinvention, and to this day I'm still not sure if I found all of his pseudonyms. And it was incredibly laborious having to type them all in each time I had a new search engine. But what I do know is that he was born Antonio Adolfo Carvelli in Turin in 1879, an ideal modern boy. The son of a maestro de musica, he was classically trained in opera, spoke 6 languages, and spent some time in the military in the officer class. But he, too, had desires that his life could not accommodate. A major theft saw him flee Italy in 1901 and reinvent himself in Australia, first as an opera singer, then as a hotel barber, a con man thief who would dress as though he belonged in the hotel, wait till wealthy patrons left, skedaddle up to their room, and jimmy the door and steal their belongings. And then as a colorful entrepreneur in Australia's Wild West gold rush. There was prison in between here as well. Then finally, as a pimp in the Western Australian goldfields. He profited immensely. His suits were tailored, his fingers were heavy with gold. It was here that he met his wife, Veronique White, who had come to the Wild West to mine the miners, selling sex to the mostly Italian mine workers in Australia's deepest gold mine, owned by the magnate and later American president, Herbert Hoover. Marie Vernon, who was actually Veronique White, later Veronique Carvelli, is another person who defies any attempt to predict her through stock historical characters. She was not, as one might expect, a poor woman who fell into prostitution through desperation. She was middle class, beloved by her family, well-connected and self-assured, and she made a fortune selling sex in the goldfields. She also demonstrates how easy it was to slip out of the view of authorities and historians. She escaped back to New Zealand before the trial and was referred to in court simply as a woman unknown, which is the name of her chapter in the book. Her story reveals another facet of sexual labor in this age of consumption and globalization, and the complexities of a woman who occupied the deeply uncomfortable position of both victim and perpetrator of abuse and exploitation. It was these precise complexities that caused the police so much trouble in their attempt to investigate and prosecute Lydia Harvey's case. Detective Inspector Ernest Anderson, as far as I can tell, did his absolute best to bring Antonio Carvelli to justice. Not only had the man trafficked Lydia Harvey from New Zealand, but with another man's help, he had also brought 3 young women over from France. "Never have we had brought under our notice more despicable ruffians," he wrote in one report. But Anderson knew that the case would hinge on one crucial fact. A successful charge of trafficking required that a woman not already, and I quote, "not already be a common prostitute or of known immoral character," in order to meet the requirements of idealized victimhood required by the law. And the girls who Carvelli had trafficked largely failed on this score, because they had either slept with boyfriends or had sold sex previously in their lives. And so that meant that they were of known immoral character and could not, in a legal sense, be trafficked. So seeing the case through Ernest Anderson's eyes allowed me to see the space between narratives about trafficking and the laws used to control it. And even more crucially, the space between these laws themselves and how they ended up being applied on the ground. The idealized victimhood that the prosecution was up against had been established by decades of anti-prostitution campaigns and a growing tide of sensational journalism. It was upon a globally circulating narrative of white slavery that Guy Schofield, the New Zealand Press Association correspondent in London, drew when he reported the trial at the Great Marlborough Street Police Court in July of 1910. And he reported this trial because he knew there was a New Zealander involved. So the New Zealand High Commissioner tipped him off, and that's how he ended up in the court that day to report the trial and then break it in the New Zealand news. So Lydia Harvey, in his account, looked like an ideal victim. White, young, Anglophone, a hard-working girl who had been duped by villains. But she had snuck out of windows. She had had sex before marriage. She was already a soiled dove, or so the Wellington police claimed, before she had left New Zealand. So Antonio Carvelli's case was sent to the Central Criminal Court, and the trial was scheduled for September 1910. Meaning that something had to be done with the less than ideal witnesses in the meantime, because witnesses in cases like this had a nasty habit of completely disappearing before the trial happened. And so a well-known social worker, Eileen McDougall, was called in, and she took Lydia to a safe house she ran on Lambeth Road in South London. But while McDougall's home took advantage of the large number of charitable donations meant to fight the terrible traffic, in fact, the majority of its residents were victims of abuse within homes, schools, churches, and neighborhoods. Unlike the public, who remained more interested in stories of kidnap and trafficking perpetrated by dastardly foreign criminals, Eileen McDougall knew that the most dangerous place for a girl was usually not a railway station or a port, or a steamship, or even Buenos Aires. It was the intimate and institutional spaces of her daily life, and very often her own home. The French girls, on the other hand, because they were Catholic, were not sent to Eileen McDougall's rescue home, but instead sent to a rescue home run by Catholic nuns way out in the northwest of London where there was nothing. I have no information on them other than my very strong sense that they were extremely angry about that. And they are then later sent to France as well, to another series of reform homes. McDougall was no stranger to injustice, and Lydia Harvey's case was no different. She and Lydia sat on the witness bench and watched as Antonio Carvelli pled guilty to a lesser charge, part of a plea bargain struck to ensure that the case would not be lost when the defense revealed the immoral character of his victims. The bargain meant a minimum jail time. After the trial, McDougall faced the uphill battle of trying to find a government willing to pay Lydia Harvey's passage home. And this took months and months. Nobody wanted to pay for it. It was £28. And they were which is what they would pay for one main course at an anti-trafficking conference in Geneva, almost to the penny. 2 months later, a third-class steamship ticket was once more in Lydia Harvey's hands. She returned to New Zealand, and in defiance of those misogynistic moralists who would condemn her to misery, disease, and death because she had sold sex, in fact, she continued to live her life. I discovered that she had adventures, that she married, and I learned how, where, and when she died. But I'm not going to tell you that part, because then you'll read the book. Instead, I'll just reflect on a few things about global history. How am I doing for time? Let me see. Grand. I've got 10 minutes or so. So in a recent special issue of Past and Present on playing with scales, the global and the micro, the macro and the nano, Jan de Vries calls for a reconciling of these two modes, that is, the global and the macro, and says that the research of connecting the space in between so as to demonstrate that they are not rivals, but can be part of the same enterprise. And I think that the way in which the digitization of sources allowed me to play with scales really, really helps kind of put that into practice, this way of jumping from global trends to tiny stories. This zooming in and zooming out is, I think, something a lot of historians do often without thinking about it or theorizing it, and I don't want to over-theorizing it. But it is something that I was able to do in a way that's truly unprecedented. Not like I was truly unprecedented, but the mechanics of being able to do it are unprecedented. Thanks to this digitization, not only of sources for small history, that is genealogical data, newspapers, etc., but also sources for big history, so digital maps, digital books, online resources that can give me a real bird's eye view of any particular context. Of course, this involved a lot of in-person and in-print research as well, but often with the click of a few buttons at my desk in Cambridge, I could find out what the weather was like in Leonora, Western Australia on any given day in 1908. So in the book, there's a lot of references to weather, and all of them are based on the newspaper reports of the weather at the time in the city where they were, which took me about 20 seconds to get. This kind of thick description that otherwise, I mean, you would never, ever, ever think to look for it, because why would you spend hours and hours and hours figuring out if it was windy or if it was sunny or if it was raining? But it doesn't take hours anymore. So, yeah, click a few buttons. I could find out what the weather was like, and I could also link Leonora in Western Australia to the global mining industry, to Herbert Hoover, its owner, and the animosities between Britisher miners who formed labor unions and Hoover's Italian imports, who were seen as blackleg foreigners, undercutting wages and working in conditions far more dangerous and grueling than unionized workers would stand. I could also go and look at the Gwalia Mine local history site, which is a wonderful repository of family photographs and stories and maps and drawings and all of those sorts of things about Leonora and Gwalia. That is incredible texture for somebody who I never did manage to get out to Western Australia. So I think the most valuable aspect of playing with scales in this small yet global story was the way that it illuminated the global nexus of exploitation in which Lydia Harvey, as well as her traffickers and their prosecutors, found themselves. It was only something that I could capture by playing across multiple scales, examining the draper shop that Veronique Carvelli's father ran, the dresses she made and sold, and also the extreme labor and environmental exploitation that underwrote the clothing industry, which all helped contextualize her choice to sell sex and coerce other women to do so, in part to be able to buy her own way into the luxury commodities market. It helped me connect up the widespread coercion and labor abuse in the global entertainment industry, which Antonio Carvelli abandoned in favor of his trade in Oriental goods, silk, silver, carvings obtained from exploited laborers and sold at a markup to Western consumers, and his trade in women. So pretty much every industry he's involved in has some form of hyper-exploitation in it and some kind of global reach. I could not make sense of Carvelli without this wider frame. But I also couldn't make sense of the global silence that reigned when it came to intimate and familial sexual abuse and the global racket about white slavery, without thinking about this in the context of the individual woman named by Eileen McDougall in her increasingly cynical correspondence. Their despair, their resilience, their courage in taking the stand, their bitter disappointment and shame when a man in a room filled with men determined that no crime had been committed. And of course, this playing with scales illuminated the nexus of exploitation in Lydia Harvey's working life, in both domestic service and in sex work, which were both part of that sector that sat silently at the heart of the early 20th century global economy that historians and sociologists have come to call intimate labor. It's something I could only understand by thinking about Lydia in her own context, alone, exhausted in a suburban Wellington kitchen or in a Buenos Aires casino, alongside the sweeping histories of young working class women moving around the world who often appear only as statistics, from town to city, from country to country, in unprecedented numbers, which was the reality that underlay the global panic over trafficking in its local manifestations. Do I have time? I'm going to keep going. I'm going to skip ahead. I have a thing about whether or not this is a British world history. So you can tell me what you think about whether it's a British world history. Because, and the reason ultimately I think it is a British world history, is because it is the British world that shaped the course of Lydia's experience within the criminal justice system. And it's the fact that it's a British world history that makes her visible to me. It was her status as a white Anglophone colonial girl that meant she was identified as a useful witness in the trial against Carvelli. Unlike the other three girls Carvelli who trafficked, who had the disadvantage of being young, being French, and carrying with them the stereotype of the prostitute imposed on this group by British culture. And so the fact that they were French alone meant they weren't going to be seen as good witnesses in the case. They also had slightly checkered pasts, which the defense uncovered. They were not the kind of witnesses that would convince a judge or jury, and they were also Catholic, which is another mark against them. And it's also the British world that rendered Lydia Harvey visible to me. So people wrote about white victims, white Anglophone victims. But most importantly of all for this book, it's the fact that New Zealand and Australia are so deeply invested in their white colonial past that they have thrown millions and millions of dollars into digitizing their newspapers so that primarily people can use them to research their family history. And that meant, because this story is set in New Zealand and Australia primarily, it meant that I could find Lydia Harvey. If Lydia Harvey had gone somewhere else, like Canada, which hasn't actually digitized near as much, even though we are also deeply invested in our colonial past. I'm not saying we're not. I wouldn't have been able to find her. It's sort of that it had to have been New Zealand and Australia because they're the only places whose newspapers are digitized to the extent that I could use them this way. So I'm going to clue up. Let's see. So the last thing I'm doing in this story is trying to challenge the way historians anecdotalize humble and obscure people in social history. This book began to take shape when I got really interested in what would happen if I turned a brief case study, what's usually just an illustrative anecdote, into a full story. So instead of just using her as an example that adds color to a historical argument, what would happen if I told her full story? And not just as a grain of sand through which we can see something supposedly more significant, and not just as an exceptional normal person or a moment that illuminates more universal themes, but as an important story in its own right. What could be gained from this very long experiment in radical contextualization? Not only, I think, did it turn out to be possible, but it also was productive. It illuminated a particular nexus of work, migration, exploitation, and lived experience I could never have dealt with so holistically had I taken a different track. Storytelling is also political. Story is used again and again in contemporary anti-trafficking campaigns in a way not dissimilar to the way historians use anecdote. In these anti-trafficking campaigns today, women appear, like Lydia Harvey did in the newspaper in 1910, as exemplars, cautionary tales, headline fodder, suffering porn. If you don't know much about anti-trafficking campaigns, just Google them. You'll know exactly what I'm talking about the second the images come up. Just as they were in the early 20th century, 21st century newspaper columns are filled with stories of young women who disappear from their home countries and are found in brothels, farmers' fields, and nail bars. We traffic in these stories and we call them awareness campaigns. Ultimately, we're uninterested in the context. We don't see trafficking victims as human beings who make complex choices within systems of global inequality that we are doing little to mitigate. We care little about where they came from, why they left home, and far less even still about what happens to them afterwards. As Carol Vance puts it, these stories entertain and absolve us, and decontextualization is their narrative mode. I wrote The Disappearance of Lydia Harvey for a popular audience. From the beginning, I was writing it as a trade book, not an academic book. And it's a Trojan horse of a book. I wanted it to appear as another sensational trafficking story, to appeal to people who would pick up a book like that. But I wanted it to become something else entirely, which, by the way, makes it extremely difficult to sell, so my editor says. And I did this because we need new stories, more complex and uncomfortable stories where victims can also be perpetrators, where carceral anti-migrant solutions backfire, and put power into the hands of corrupt state and corporate actors, as well as traffickers, where women are making difficult decisions and where well-meaning systems fail them again and again, and where we reflect critically on our own role in perpetuating the exploitation that makes trafficking possible, on our own small place in big stories. And context is a word that we often use as historians, but I'm not sure we always make the most of contexts and contextualization's radical potential. But I think this is precisely the power of global microhistory and the scales that it plays. And I'll stop there for questions. Thank you.